Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Lohmeier. I really love cells, and I think that we as software folks can learn a lot about how to improve our software from cells. So, hoping this little slide advancer works. Yeah. Okay, so this talk I'm going to give you some background about me. I'm going to give you some background about cells. I'm kind of assuming a high school level knowledge of biology. I don't want any of the biology stuff to go over anyone's head. I also don't want any of the software stuff to go over anyone's head. We're going to be talking about how cells apply to programming. I focus this specifically on programming rather than software in general, because I could come up with 2 entire other talks about how security or DevOps relate to cells. But this is going to be programming specific. And hopefully you're going to get some solid takeaway points of how you can improve your software from lessons from the cell. So for a little bit about me, I'm a software developer at ThoughtWorks. Our San Francisco office is literally next door, so it's very convenient for me to come down here today. And I am very biased. So you'll notice some of these biases in my opinions on what the cells can teach us. You'll notice me talking about object-oriented programming. In general, I prefer pair programming. I prefer to drive my development with tests, and I believe in an agile methodology. I'll explain these more in the talk as they come up, but keep an eye out for those. Don't be scared if you've heard those before and noticed me talking about them at length. Before I was a software developer, I had a past life working in a cell biology research lab where I studied mouse digit regeneration. So these images at the bottom are things that we've come up with in the lab. The idea of all of our research is, so sometimes things happen, and you might get a little bit of a finger or a toe cut off, right? And most of the time, if it's cut off too low, it'll just stub over. But we're trying to figure out in the lab the exact combination of proteins that you can apply in a correct order to figure out how to make that digit regrow. So that was some fun stuff, and then I got into software, which was also fun stuff. So I got my undergrad degree in computer science and cell molecular biology, spending 4 years just really intensely thinking about these 2 different kinds of systems side by side. And the interesting thing for me is that cell systems are a system that we study how they evolved under natural selection. And with software, we're trying to figure out how to build and craft our own systems to solve these really tricky problems. So for some background about cells. Cells are awesome, quite frankly. They've found cells surviving everywhere. They've found them in little sheets of ice in glaciers. They found cells surviving in boiling pits of acid out in like Wyoming or wherever. Everywhere. Cells do amazing things. They turn sunlight into sugar. They send thoughts through your brains. And they're the basic unit of life. So a cell, by definition, is the smallest self-sustaining and self-replicating biochemical system. They can be independent, unicellular, or interdependent. And they're the world's oldest code base. Genetic information, as stored in your DNA, has been refactoring itself for the last couple billion years. And it operates through molecular machinery. So there are 4 core macromolecules that sort of do everything in the cell. There's carbohydrates, lipids, which is just a fancy word for fats. There's nucleic acids, which is just DNA and its less popular cousin, RNA. And then there are proteins. Proteins do most of the heavy lifting, so that's most of what I'm going to be talking about here today. And there are 3 key lessons that I think that we can really focus, that the cell tends to outperform machines in consistently. So the first thing that cells do very, very well is they minimize complexity. This is your little familiar double helix for DNA. All of the information needed to make all of the proteins for every single organism on Earth is stored through just these 4 different nucleotides in just a complex pattern. Cells also tend to grow iteratively. So as opposed to just sort of coming up with some legs and then walking around on land, you had a little amoeba that floats around in the sea, and then slowly that learned to cling onto a little rock, and it slowly started to learn movement over a very long period of time. You also notice that cells will respond appropriately to changes. And the key word there is appropriately. Cells don't respond too quickly or too slow. They don't respond over the top dramatic, right? Because that'd be a waste of resources. Sometimes you'll notice your software responding dramatically. Cells don't do that. So lesson 1, minimize complexity. For any cell in your body, there's not really a guarantee that your diet is supplying all of the nutrients that it'll need. Instead, the cell breaks down every single thing that you might eat and converts it into a key set of nutrients. And that's what this little diagram is showing. So this is supposed to represent a cell. In here is the mitochondria, which is where it actually produces the energy, which are these little ATP guys right here. Everything that you eat, more or less, gets broken down into glucose, or one of these other little components in this process. At the end of the day, all of these intermediaries are used just to make ATP, which is sort of your cell's battery. Inside our code, I'm sure you guys have all touched a code base that has a different function for every single bit of work that needs to be done. Instead, it's useful to focus on how we can reuse and combine our existing code to make it reusable. In a lot of ways, this will just involve extracting classes, functions, and variables instead of generating them all over again. There's this principle called dry, don't repeat yourself. It's a good one to keep in mind. Cells definitely tend to stay dry. The trick here is that you don't want to necessarily go through hoops to make your code reusable. It's more about reusing the ideas. And the balance there that you have to strike is between reusing things and avoiding unintentional interdependency. So with this cell, the mitochondria, because it has such a specialized little role, it has its own DNA, and it makes its own proteins that it uses. So that's entirely separate from what's going on for the rest of the cell because its role is so specialized, and it's so essential to supporting life. Those things are just kept totally separate. In your code, this is going to look like encapsulation. There's this idea called Demeter's principle that's about making sure that your code doesn't touch anything that's too far away from it, right? And that's the same thing that's going on in the cell. So for example, in React, there's this concept of reducers. And reducers change the state in a React app by having actions fire on reducers. And all of the actions in your entire app will get fired against all of the reducers. But reducers tend to get split up into different components of the app. So if you have an action in one area, it will apply on the reducers throughout the entire app. So if you have two of them named the same thing, you're going to have all sorts of unfortunate side effects. And the easiest way to deal with that is to make sure that you just name them separately. Make sure that all of the things in one area are all related to that area. The second lesson from the cell is to grow iteratively. So this is a picture of a neuron growing. And you'll notice that this is the sort of core area, and then it's sending out these little branches. And the cell adds and removes complexity through this slow iterative growth. When this neuron is first created and it first buds off from its parent, it contains just the bare minimum concentration of proteins and cytoplasm that it needs to survive. I'm sure you guys have all heard of a minimum viable product, or MVP. Every single time I hear that, I think of the word viable, because this cell has exactly what it needs to act independently and provide its own small little unit of independent value and still survive in the wild. If it had all these branches already extended out, it wouldn't be the minimum viable product. So when you sit down to write a new little bit of code, make sure that it's the smallest unit that can survive in the wild. Once you complete your MVP, it's useful to add in successive new features and functionality from there. So the same way that this neuron, it starts off as just this core little green area. And then once that's budded off and in the wild, it can shoot out these little branches and form new connections. It doesn't start off already connected. For example, I was working on a shell script once that its core functionality was really like the one special thing that it did was it made an API call. And it also, I wanted it to only make this API call after it went through a couple user prompts, and then it would do the thing. So I started by where I wanted the shell script to start, with the user prompts. And I went up and I told my friend that I'd started to work on this really cool shell script. I thought it was going to make our days a lot easier. And he's like, well, that's great. Like, what have you gotten done so far? And I'm like, I got a couple user prompts done. If I had just sat down and thought about the actual unit of value, which was the API call, I would have already had that done, and I would have already been providing value. After creating your MVP, you want to immediately check it into your code base. In a cell, there's never really any latency between what's actually stored in the genetic code and what's actually being expressed. That's a goal that we should all try and strive for. There's this concept of continuous integration and continuous deployment, where instead of building a thing and making sure it's great and building up your app and then sending it off into the wild, you can start with just the smallest unit and then continuously update your code base and continuously deploy whatever's in your code base. That's how the cell functions pretty much all the time. You also want to use feedback to guide your growth. So when you're applying these small little incremental changes, you want to be sure that you're basing your decision on what functionality to add in next on what feedback you're getting from users or from the actual process of developing, your fellow developers. So the neuron doesn't automatically know what direction it needs to branch out, right? It's just this little green thing when it's born. So it sends out all these little feelers in all these different directions. And the feelers look around and they detect electrical activity. And if they sense a lot of electrical activity, they send a signal back into the main part of the cell telling it to keep branching out in this area and keep growing. If there aren't as many electrical signals over here, these feelers send a signal back into the cell to tell them to pull those feelers back in. So in code, this often looks like using tests to drive where you're going to add new features and how you're going to implement new features. So if you start off, before you ever actually write a function, before you actually write new code, if you start by writing a test for the functionality that you want to implement, you can, based on how easy it is to write that test and how easy it is to make that test pass, you can decide whether or not that's a good approach for you. If you can't write the test or if you can't make it pass easily, it's a good sign that it's maybe time to try implementing it a different way. Lesson 3 from the cell is to craft appropriate responses. So neurons using feedback to guide their growth is an example of how cells respond to their environments. And overall, cells are really good at responding at the right size and speed to internal and external changes. In the same way, we can think ahead to what changes we would need to make quickly or slowly within our code base. So for a big permanent change that doesn't have to happen quickly, you don't necessarily have to build it in advance. And it's valuable to not build it in advance and instead treat it as a new growth and go slowly from there. So in an app, if you had to change a starting point in your app, if you have to completely create a new page for that, it's not useful to create that in advance as a backup and make that change quickly. It's useful to create it slowly over time. In the cell, big permanent changes like this are something like menopause, where you have that's a change that has to happen over a very long period of time, and it has to be permanent. So you have very large, bulky intercellular signal molecules that go into the cell, and they permanently change what's expressed in the actual DNA. So they change what proteins the DNA is creating at any given time. And that's a slow process. On the other hand, if you wanted to have a really fast change, it won't even go into the DNA. It'll be a very small signal molecule that will activate a response in the actual cell. So this is the nucleus here, and this is the outer rim of the cell, and this is just everywhere outside of it. So you have a little receptor in the cell. This is a signal molecule triggering a signal, and what they'll do is they'll go into the cytosol, so not into the nucleus, which takes a while. Instead, they will activate pre-existing proteins that have already been created and are just waiting to be turned on. Inside your code, this is going to look like variables that you can change really quickly. So in an app, this will be storing your settings in environmental variables, and then of course, setting values that you have to change a lot in variables inside your code base. So as someone who has spent far too many minutes and hours of my life just changing one value over and over and over again because I thought it was going to be the last time I ever had to change that one URL in all those links, I can testify that it's a lot easier if you just go ahead and simplify things to these points that are easy to change. So some takeaway points. Lesson 1, minimize complexity. You want to reuse ideas and patterns and code if you can, but your main goal here is to make code modular, following Demeter's principle. Lesson 2 is to grow iteratively, create an MVP, and then grow successively from there. Check it in immediately, and use feedback, in our case, tests, to guide your growth. Lesson 3 is crafting appropriate responses, so figuring out whether changes in your code base need to be fast or slow. And if they're slow, not building them in advance, but treating them as new growth. And if they're fast, reworking your structure to allow for easy changes. The other point here is handling errors thoughtfully. So when you have an error in your code, I think oftentimes it's our instinct to just sort of deal with it by either ignoring it or just letting the default behavior happen. Instead, you should only crash your app if the error prevents effective use of the app. So if a cell gets a signal that it doesn't recognize, so back on this page, you have this receptor, and receptors can recognize a bunch of different molecules. If your cell gets a signal molecule that it doesn't recognize against a receptor, it won't do anything. In your code base, this might be the equivalent of just doing a console logging an error and moving on. If it brushes against an actual toxin, the cell will stop working, right? And this is the equivalent of crashing your app. It's a healthy thing, it just needs to be proportional. So those are the takeaway points. I hope that's valuable to you. I hope you learned a lot about cells. I hope you remembered some great best practices, maybe learned something new. I wasn't sure if there were going to be questions here, so feel free to grab me if you see me walking around or send questions here. Thank you so much for listening.